This is the Marketing Podcast Network.
Stories influence, teach, and inspire us. But what about the storytellers who create them? Uncorking a Story profiles storytellers to uncover how their background and life experiences influence the stories they create. We learn what motivates them, their path to success, and what fuels them to keep creating. It all starts by asking one simple question: where does your story begin? Welcome to Uncorking a Story. Now here's your host, Mike Carlin.
Well, hello and welcome to Uncorking a Story. I'm your host, Mike Carlin, and today I'm excited to introduce you to Colin Dickey. Colin is a writer, speaker, and academic who has made a career out of collecting unusual objects and hidden stories all over the country. He's the author of multiple books, including Ghostland, An American History in Haunted Places, and The Unidentified, Mythical Monsters, Alien Encounters, and Our Obsession with the Unexplained. He joins me today on Uncorking a Story to talk about his latest book, Under the Eye of Power: How Fear of Secret Societies Shapes American Democracy. Welcome to Uncorking a Story, Colin.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Happy to have you here, Colin. I'm curious, where does your story as an author begin?
Where does my story as an author begin? Watching Young Guns 2 when I was like 12 years old was the moment. I think I'd seen that movie a couple times on cable, and just one night I got really into this idea of just like writing Westerns. So I went upstairs, took my mother's Smith Corona electric typewriter and wrote like a 2-page Western, like where I sort of included all my friends, and we all got shot at the end. So it begins there. That's sort of
so Young Guns 2. I mean, that's the one where John Bon Jovi did the entire soundtrack to that, right?
Yeah, that is the John Bon Jovi one. It is, in retrospect, inferior to Young Guns 1, I have to say. I think I still maintain, and this is a weird fact, that of all of the cinematic representations of the Lincoln County War, Young Guns remains the most historically accurate. So I don't know. I stand by that movie, but yeah, that's where it started. Young Guns too.
There is a song on there. I don't know if it's You Really Got Me. I can't remember, but if I look at my high school yearbook, I graduated in 1992. I have a quote from a song from Young Guns 2, and it just makes me cringe every time I look at it. My kids are like, "Why do you have this in here?" And I'm like, "You don't understand." Like I was,
them's were the times. I mean, my high school yearbook had like Jack Kerouac in it, so I don't know if that's a significant improvement. I think, again, I'd probably take Bon Jovi now over Kerouac.
Well, tell me about that Western. I mean, did you film it, or did you just act it out?
No, it was just a short story, and it was, and okay. At the time I was reading Stephen King incessantly, and I was sort of I had read by that point more or less like everything Stephen King had in print, and I really wanted to be Stephen King, so I almost immediately started writing like horror stories, horror fiction. Through most of my high school years, I would come home every day and either play bass guitar or write stories and just churn them out. Just really, derivative knockoffs of Stephen King or whatever else I happened to be reading, Lovecraft or whatever. But I just kind of kept on churning them out. And I did that through most of my high school years until at some point I started writing poetry instead. So I came to nonfiction very late. I was going to be a fiction writer for a very long time. So
yeah. Well, tell me, what's your fascination with all things kind of unexplained?
I mean, the thing that for me, it was like growing up in a suburban landscape in San Jose, California, growing up where everything looked the same. There was nothing to do except play like little league sports or go to the mall. It was just this kind of boring, dead, flat capitalist landscape that I just hated. And yeah, by the time again, it started with Stephen King. It started with the premise of a Stephen King novel, more or less, is this idea that there's something there's a darkness at the edge of town. There's something sort of beneath the surface, something lurking, something that is sort of actually, terrifying or wrong or uncanny. And I think that really resonated for me as someone who just like looked out at the world around me and just like was like bored out of my skull. And, as I started sort of branching out, reading other things, and I discovered the beats, with, like Kerouac, when I was like 16. And again, this idea that there was this kind of subterranean landscape of, drug users and queer people and criminals and poets and that kind of thing, I think really appealed to me. I think I've always sort of been like fascinated with like the world below the surface. And, yeah, it took a while, but eventually it kind of came out through these last couple of books I've written, which are sort of just various ways of looking at, kind of the invisible world, whether or not it's like ghosts or UFOs or Bigfoot or, the Illuminati. Like all of these books have in common this idea that there are these things that are sort of operating at the margins or below the surface or in sort of these invisible ways that, have an impact on culture. And again, I'm not interested in proving or disproving. Well, I'm interested in disproving a lot of conspiracy theories, but I'm not interested in proving or disproving ghosts per se, or Bigfoot. I don't really care about whether or not he exists or not, but I am interested in sort of how these things affect mainstream culture, even though they sort of exist kind of in like, kind of fringe culture.
You remember, it's probably in the late 80s, mid to late 80s. It was Time Life Books. They always had these, book series. They had Mysteries of the Unexplained. Do you remember those?
Oh, yeah. 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 I mean, I remember those. I remember like, yeah, those commercials were always on TV incessantly. Like a woman burns her hand on the stove and, 500 miles away, her twin sister cries out in pain, like that.
Yes.
I totally remember that commercial. Yeah. And like, like I always remember Leonard Nimoy, that Leonard Nimoy show In Search Of.
Oh, yeah, that was great.
Yeah. That stuff was like really, really kind of popular in the 80s. I mean, I guess it's always popular. It seemed sort of popular in the 80s, but then by the 90s, it had just become the X-Files. And, now it's sort of resurgent on, Instagram and all this stuff. So it never really goes away. But I definitely remember the form it took in the 70s and 80s, the kind of thing you would watch on like, TV on a Saturday afternoon, or you would see these commercials for these Time Life series.
When I was a kid, I was like scared to death of a few things, right? So one was killer bees. Another was quicksand, and I was disappointed. I've never actually come across quicksand. But a third would have been like being abducted by aliens. Like I was scared to death as a kid that I was going to get beamed up and, anally probed or something like that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, well, first of all, wait, does quicksand exist? Can you actually drown? Like, I know I've not come across it, but like, is it a thing at all?
I mean, it was on Gilligan's Island, right? Yeah. I remember like, and like various like stories that I've seen, but yeah, I don't know that it actually exists in nature.
Yeah. So scratch that one. Killer bees, that's legit, right? You can die from killer bees.
You
right?
can. They haven't come to my neighborhood yet, I guess is what I'm saying. Like I haven't been, face to face with killer bees.
Yeah, and alien abductions. I mean, sure, yeah. No, a friend of mine had that Whitley Strieber book, Communion. And I remember it's been written about that cover. That cover is so iconic. It's so like perfect in what it does. And for some reason I didn't read that book as a kid, although I remember being sort of fascinated and like horrified by it. Like it was sort of so, but yeah, I think like a kind of foregone conclusion that these abductions were real, they were happening. That just sort of seemed to be part of the zeitgeist. But I remember at what moment I sort of stopped caring or stopped believing in alien abductions. Did you ever like grow out of it? Are you still afraid of it?
No, I'm not really afraid of it anymore. Because the older you get, you watch and I'm still like captivated by the shows, whether it's on like Discovery Channel or whatever. And then you realize that like all of the people who claim to be abducted have something in common, which is usually that they're batshit crazy or they've got some kind of substance abuse problem. They're alone in the woods, no one else is with them. So you kind of like, okay, well, I'm not so sure that this is legit. And I remember coming to that conclusion when I was reading Sammy Hagar's autobiography, and he talks about an alien encounter he had. And on the next page, he talks about dropping lots of acid. So
sure,
who knows? Who knows? But
yeah, I mean, I'm trying to remember. Like, I remember like there would be these TV specials. Like, again, it would be like Saturday night at 8 p.m. on, CNN, or not even. This was sort of pre CNN, but like whatever, like sort of reputable TV channels, and it would be like the Alien Autopsy or like
right.
Area 51 Exposed, and I would get pretty excited about them. But they're like, even then, I mean, I was like, like a, junior high or maybe like a teen, in high school at the time. And even then I sort of was like, well, there's no there. There's no, like, it's a lot of like smoke and mirrors and like, some grainy footage, but like, and, they would kind of end with saying, who knows if it, like there's more to come. But I was like, I didn't see any there. And I think at some point I just kind of was like, like, I mean, I've been telling people recently, I was like, if UFOs exist, we're not going to find out about it because one lone whistleblower goes to one news reporter and it gets written up in one newspaper. If UFOs exist, you are going to know about it. They're going to interrupt everything. They're going, it's going to be wall-to-wall coverage. It's going to be all over social media. Nobody will be able to talk about anything else at all. And so I think, yeah, like even from an early age, I was sort of just like aware of the fact that like, this is not how like news stories are broken. They're not broken by like a Saturday night special that hints at a thing and then you never hear about it again. Like that's just, so anyways. Yeah. So that's, I think, my thoughts on that.
Right well, now. Let's talk about Under the Eye of Power. What can you share with us about your latest book?
I can share lots of things. What would you like to know about it?
Well, just give me an overview. Give me what's it all about?
Yeah. So again, like, so I'd done this book, Ghostland, An American History in Haunted Places, which was about haunted houses, haunted, hotels, prisons, whatever, and sort of why some buildings are haunted and some aren't, why we tell the stories that we do, why are so many stories in America about, quote unquote, haunted Indian burial grounds, that kind of thing. And then I went from there to my last book, The Unidentified, which was, Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster and other cryptids, but also aliens, alien abductions, that kind of thing. And again, like the through line was this kind of idea of like kind of things that were hidden or invisible, but yet still, and sort of unprovable, but still had a sort of effect on American culture. And so from there, I think like when I was moving out during my divorce, a friend of mine sort of helped me move, and we were sort of driving this U-Haul, and he just sort of said to me, he's like, yeah, it seems like the next book is on secret societies. And I had a lot of that material left over and I hadn't figured out a way to use it. But I sort of finally kind of clicked a few months later on this idea of the way in which we sort of hypothesize and sort of fantasize about these secret societies, some of which are real but harmless, some of which are real and maybe not as harmful as we think, some of which are completely fabricated. Everything from, the Freemasons to the Illuminati to, sort of anti-Catholic and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, as well as, kind of other things I wasn't expecting to kind of delve into, but I wanted to kind of chart the way in which America's sort of American democracy and specifically has been kind of influenced from almost the very beginning by the way we think about these like secret groups who are operating the levers of power behind the scenes, mostly imagined, mostly sort of fantastical conspiracy theories, some little bits of truth here and there though.
Right. Like what was the one that was mentioned in there was a Mike Myers movie, So I Married an Axe Murdering, the Pentaverate, right? The Pentaverate,
right? Yes, yeah. The Gettys, the Rothschilds, the Queen. What's the fourth one? I can't remember. The Vatican and Colonel Sanders.
Colonel Sanders, that's right. Those beady little eyes.
Right. Yeah. Puts an addictive chemical in his chicken that makes you crave it fortnightly. I mean, yeah, like that. Who doesn't believe that theory? Right. So yeah. So I wanted to kind of understand like how those theories kind of got their start and what they do for us as Americans. Like why do we come back to them? Why how they evolved, what, where did they go, that kind of thing. So that's kind of what the book does. It's sort of historical and sort of starts with the founding of the country. Because I think like a lot of people looked at 2016, saw a presidential candidate who was openly espousing conspiracy theories about, secret groups like the deep state. And we're like, wow, we've never had this before, never seen this before. But in fact, we have, George Washington was one of many people who thought that the Illuminati were responsible for the French Revolution. Abraham Lincoln rose to power by successfully arguing that there was a secret cabal of slave owners who had corrupted the government from within. Nixon was a famous anti-Semite. Hillary Clinton believed that the government had more information about aliens that they weren't sharing. Like this is a thing that crosses party lines and has sort of been part of American politics since the beginning. And so I wanted to kind of present that historically to sort of understand how these things came about and what we might be able to do to kind of stop them or something like that.
So like, I think about things like natural selection, right? So there are traits that we have that live on because they serve some kind of a useful purpose. What is the useful purpose of a conspiracy theory?
I mean, it does, a conspiracy theory does a bunch of different things. It does different things to different people. Some of the through lines, I think, that are really important is a conspiracy theory gives like a shape and order to the world that might otherwise seem chaotic or random. So if you believe that the world events are determined by a secret group who meet in a boardroom wearing pinstripe suits and chomping cigars, and are sort of determining things, and maybe they're the Rothschilds, maybe they are the Illuminati, whatever. That's scary. That may be, terrifying to you, but it actually may be more reassuring than the idea that everything that you see out there is just sort of random chance. I mean, I think that what conspiracy theories do is they make things make sense. And particularly the ones that I looked at in the book, I mean, like, again, like a, kind of famous and notorious and sort of vile examples, anti-Semitism, in the way that like the way anti-Semitism is structured, it accounts for any possible event of the day, because, the anti-Semite believes that the Jews are both like, purely malevolent, purely pernicious, but also impenetrable. Their reasoning is impenetrable because, I mean, the two the sort of main cliches associated with anti-Semitism are the fact that they are rapacious, hyper-capitalist bankers, and also that they are anarchist Bolsheviks. And the fact that these two caricatures are totally opposed to one another, they're completely at odds, I think speaks to the levels of the way anti-Semitism works as a conspiracy theory. It's supposed to be convoluted and contradictory because then anything can be attributed to the Jews, and that's sort of how these things work. So that's, I think, one thing that conspiracy theories do. I think the other main thing they do, and what I talk about a lot in the book, is that they're very useful for pushing back against social change and attempting to delegitimize social change and social movements. So again, this is another sort of vile example, but I think it's a sort of obvious one that speaks to the point. During the civil rights era, you had people arguing that Black Americans were not interested in their liberation, were not interested in equality, were not interested in being treated like equal citizens. That in fact the whole thing was a put on by Bolshevik Jews. Again, as another sort of anti-Semitic sort of version of things, but it's a way of delegitimizing, a progressive social movement. And I saw that time and time again throughout the book, that like these conspiracy theories get used to push back against demographic change, societal change. Whenever a group of Americans or an immigrant group tries to assert, their rights and their visibility, often it's met with various conspiracy theories that try to delegitimize that movement. And that's something obviously we're seeing right now with the kind of, obsession with, quote unquote groomers, which is a response to, LGBTQ Americans and particularly trans Americans sort of asserting their rights and their visibility.
Yeah. It's like gaslighting on a massive scale, right? So
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
but I mean, they do speak to like they pull an emotional lever, right? And sometimes I think, okay, well, maybe it's people who are, perhaps less intelligent who fall for these things, but that's probably not the case, is it?
No, oh no, and I think that's a common misconception, and the thing I wanted to really address in this book is I think that, yeah, the assumption is that somebody believes in a conspiracy theory because they're ill-informed or they're stupid, or they're irrational, and I don't think any of that is the case. I mean, I certainly think there are people out there who believe in conspiracy theories, but I don't think that's what makes you a believer. I think what a conspiracy theory does is it solves an existential or an emotional or intellectual need for you, and that it allows you to overlook the facts and construct the world in a way that's pleasing or reassuring or affirming to you. And I think that both crosses partisan divides. I think people on the left are very sanguine about the fact that they sort of see themselves as smarter and more enlightened, and I don't think history shows that. But it also really doesn't matter about one's education. Again, people like Nixon, who were sort of famously, educated elites who are also anti-Semites. Like it's really less about one's sort of intellectual capacity or education and more about someone's emotional need that drives them to find what they're looking for in a conspiracy theory.
Yeah. And I'm sure they're not just a tool of like the right or the far right. I'm sure the left has had their share of conspiracy theories as well, I'd imagine.
Oh, well, certainly. And like, again, like, they take different forms off, obviously. And like, I think on the left, you're more likely to see sort of government conspiracy theories, although now that's shifting with the quote unquote deep state. But, for the longest time, the idea that the government was sort of doing nefarious things, which again was sort of based in fact. I talk a lot in the book about the CIA and the FBI. And sort of what they were up to in the 50s and 60s that sort of created this kind of perpetual distrust, this idea that our government sort of cannot be trusted by members of both the left and the right. But the other thing is that the other sort of form that left conspiracy theories often take is sort of corporate malevolence, and again that's sort of based in fact. I mean, you have the tobacco lobby, which is sort of a good example of an actual literal conspiracy. But, it sort of has evolved and morphed to, you will hear people talking about Monsanto, for example, sort of a famous sort of, bugbear for the left as something that goes beyond just a sort of crappy corporation who's out to make profits above, any consideration for people's health, to a thing that is sort of somehow ubiquitous and omnipotent and omnipresent, sort of doing horrible things on an almost sort of supernatural level.
Yeah. And then, I thinking about like in more recent times, with COVID and the vaccines, these conspiracy theories that, people like Bill Gates and all these people in high tech are funding these vaccines for population control or something like that. It's pretty wild. I mean, I guess as long as there's creativity in the world, there's going to be some interesting conspiracy theories out there.
Yeah, I mean, sure. Yeah, this is not something that's going away anytime soon. I think, again, the discourse of the last 10 years has been, by and large, people wanting to believe that this was a result of social media. It was a result of Cambridge Analytica. It was a result of algorithms at Facebook or whatever, sort of pushing these beliefs on us. And while I think that social media is wildly damaging in a lot of ways, it is not the sole culprit here. Because we've had these conspiracy theories, as I discussed in the book, since the founding of the country, if not before, and B, because they do something sort of emotional and intellectual that's satisfying for us. And I think that the solution is not going to be in just sort of lambasting Facebook or, maybe, attempting to craft regulations that probably will never get passed anyways. The solution is more in sort of understanding what drives us to these things in the first place and how we can sort of combat that on a more kind of interpersonal level.
Right. Yeah. They're vehicles for distribution, but they're not why these conspiracy theories get created. I mean, if they go away, something else will just take their place. I mean, yeah, I was curious. You were mentioning, a lot of conspiracy theories arise from like trying to make sense in sort of a senseless world. To me, and I don't want to compare conspiracy theories and religion because that's maybe not 100% fair, but that's really the role religion played in earlier societies, I would imagine, is trying to create some kind of order out of disorder or chaos.
Yeah, sure. And I think it's not an unwarranted comparison at all. The philosopher Karl Popper is the guy who coins the phrase conspiracy theory. And he does so in 1947, I think. The line being, the conspiracy theory's vision of society happens when you get rid of God and ask what's in his place, right? So again, like, this idea that the Illuminati or whomever are behind the scenes pulling the strings and are responsible for anything that happens on a day-to-day basis, and can be used to explain anything from the success of Beyonce to why I got a parking ticket. That's I think that's a theological proposition. That's, you're proposing that the Illuminati have supplanted God as an explanatory mechanism for the way of the world. And so I think it's very sort of like theological, and it's in its appeal to people.
I didn't know much about the Illuminati until I read one of those Dan Brown books. And then it seems like every book that had followed, not necessarily Dan Brown, but a bunch of authors around that same time, they were all just sort of interested in the Illuminati, or maybe he jump-started like thinking about it again. What is the basis of the Illuminati? I mean, when did that come into existence, I should say, like the conspiracy theory around the Illuminati?
So the Illuminati are a group that existed briefly in Bavaria, Germany in the 1770s. They sort of advocated women's rights and atheism and birth control and all these things. And they didn't get very far before the Bavarian government got wind and suppressed them. And that was the end of the Illuminati. They had ceased to exist by the end of the 1770s. But what happens is, in the wake of the French Revolution, you have, this sort of glorious experiment in democracy that suddenly goes haywire, that, it ends up bloody, it ends up violent, it ends up catastrophic and chaotic. And a couple of people, a French priest who's sort of trying to understand what happened to his Catholic country, and a Scottish Freemason simultaneously argue that what happened with the French Revolution was actually the mechanism or the machinations of the Illuminati, that somehow they survived and are responsible for this. And so that becomes a really sort of useful explanatory mechanism for world events that otherwise seem chaotic or unexpected or unpredictable. And so the theory moves almost immediately to the United States. As I mentioned earlier, George Washington is among many people who think that the Illuminati are active. The Alien and Sedition Act is passed in part as a sort of response to the fear that foreign saboteurs, including the Illuminati, are going to be sort of infiltrating America. And by 1800, which is our first, after Washington's 2 terms, like our first contested presidential election, both Jefferson and Adams have, supporters who are basically alleging that the other guy is a stooge for the Illuminati. And so our first like real presidential election is already one sort of riven and beset by conspiracy theories.
So where do we go from here? It's like where how can we? Because I do think that these things are can be very dangerous. Just talking about anti-Semitism alone. I mean, look what that's led to. How do you stop it, or at least sort of squash it a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, for me, a couple of things. I mean, I think that sort of the first thing is, as we were talking about before, to recognize that it's not about just being stupid or ill-informed. And so if you want to kind of work on somebody, you can't just like browbeat them with facts and data. That actually doesn't work, because it's not what they're looking for. And I think it's more about sort of understanding what the emotional appeal, what the emotional drive is for that person, and kind of deprogramming them almost, one at a time, sort of trying to sort of understand how to kind of like replace whatever the conspiracy theory is doing for that person with, something else that's maybe a little bit more grounded, and then you can kind of gradually bring in the facts and kind of wean them off it. But I think the road ahead of us is hard. I think there's a lot of work to be done, and I don't think it's sort of like patient, difficult work, and it's something we got to kind of get started on. Yeah.
Well, there we go. One of the ways I like to get to know my guests a little bit more is through pop culture. So I'm curious, Colin, when you were growing up, what were some of your favorite things to watch on TV?
I don't know. When I was growing up, God, I can't remember. I watched so little TV now. At the time, I mean, I don't know. I remember more of the movies that I watched. I mean, I was like in love with like, Batman and Indiana Jones. Nothing particularly interesting. Again, I was just kind of a suburban kid. I was just kind of like whatever I was fed at the time. I'm trying to remember anything special, but not coming up with anything.
What about a favorite King novel?
Yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, definitely, I think The Stand was always my favorite. As I got older, I really came to appreciate his short stories, because they didn't have happy endings. They didn't have like resolutions. The short stories are the ones that really like messed me up. There's a short story called The Jaunt, which remains kind of one of like the most terrifying things I think I've ever read in my life. So yeah.
I haven't read too many of the short stories, but I love The Stand. That was, I mean, that's such a great one, and it for the most part I liked.
Yeah,
I thought it got a little weird at the end, but
yeah, yeah. No, I loved the remake, or at least the chapter 1 of that remake from a couple years ago. I thought that was really great.
Yeah. Better than the one with John Ritter and who else was in that? John
Curry. I mean, Tim Curry as Pennywise was great, but no, I thought the new one was really great. I don't know, it left me with like a really just like, it's kind of perverse to say, but just like a really like solidly good feeling. Like I came out of that theater just like feeling great about the first one. The second one was fine, but the first one was really fantastic. So
yeah. What about a favorite place to read? Do you have a favorite place you like to read?
Oh, I do all my reading and writing in cafes. I just, I like to wake up and go get a coffee and sit and read and, kind of watch the world go by. So
that was my next one, which was a favorite place to write, but also a cafe.
Yeah.
What about music growing up? I know you played bass, but what were you into listening? What were you listening to?
Oh, I listened to a great deal of Iron Maiden. I mean, metal generally, but Iron Maiden was the be all end all, and still is as far as I'm concerned. So.
Favorite Maiden album?
Oh, I mean, controversially, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. I'm
100%.
I mean, it's
100%.
I mean, it's not. It doesn't have the same level of iconic classics as Number of the Beast and Power Slave, but it is no skips, and it's perfect all the way through.
Yeah, man, Infinite Dreams. If I ever had a boat, I think I would name it Infinite Dreams.
Yeah.
But that's probably not going to happen. But if I did, Infinite Dreams, maybe the big picture of Eddie.
Yeah,
I
like it. Yeah.
Pirates would not screw with me. And then last but not least, if you could sort of go back in time and whisper some words of advice into your younger self, what would you tell the younger Colin?
It'll be fine. That's, I think, what I would tell my younger self. Yeah.
Kind of reassure them. Were you anxious back in the day, or?
I don't know. I just was unhappy. Yeah. So
you won't always be in the suburbs, kid.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Very good. Well, guest today has been Colin Dickey. His book is Under the Eye of Power: How Fear of Secret Societies Shapes American Democracy. Colin, where can people pick up this book?
Oh, you can pick it up wherever fine books are sold. It should be out wherever you would like to buy a book. It should be there.
There you go. And then, Colin, any social media handles or websites you want to share with the listeners if they want to follow you?
Yeah, I mean, my website is just colindickey.com. I'm mostly these days on Instagram and Blue Sky. I basically abandoned Twitter as it's become a mess. And I got off Facebook years ago, but I'm pretty easy to find on Instagram, just Colin Dickey. And if you happen to be on Blue Sky, I'm also Colin Dickey. So people can drop by and say hi.
There you go. Well, Colin, thank you for stopping by Uncorking a Story and letting me uncork yours.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlin uncork a new story.